Today we will be talking about Chritopher Pittman. This 12-year-old boy was once described as polite and shy, but now he's known across the world as South Carolina's youngest criminal. At 12 years old, most kids get their first cell phone or their first kiss. Meanwhile, Chris, he was driving his first getaway car. Chris's case is unique because not only is he recorded as one of the youngest criminals in the US, but his story started a very significant legal battle with medication distributors and doctors. Chris was on medication for mental illness, and he and his parents claimed that it was his prescription's fault for his actions, not his. But there are some very important details to this case that we need to discuss. So let's start from the beginning. Chritopher Frank Pittman was born on April 9th, 1989 in Franklin, Massachusetts. He lived with his father and older sister. His mom was no longer in the picture as she left the family when Chris was very young. Chris had gotten used to this, and his dad got remarried. Growing up, Chris was very involved in his church and enjoyed spending time with friends. Things were going pretty well. But when Chris was 12 years old, his mom came back without warning. Since Chris was older now, he had more of an emotional attachment to the idea that she would stay this time and that he would have a mother again. But she left the same way she came, with no explanation. Chris didn't even get to say goodbye or know why she decided to disappear again. This broke his heart. To make matters worse, Chris's dad was going through his third divorce. Chris's relationship with his father was rocky, to say the least. Things were hard at home. Though Chris seemed to have a supportive community within his church and friends, things only got worse. This new version of Chris emerged, and it was anything but the polite and quiet kid we once knew. He started to become known for his unpredictable behavior. He ran away from home twice, threatened to end his life with a large kitchen blade, and was picked up by police a handful of times in the process. When things continued to go downhill with Chris's behavior, his father decided it was best to have him sent to a facility for troubled children. He was forced to stay at this facility for 6 days, and one of the treatment options included medication. Chris was diagnosed with depression and was put on a prescription called Paxil. Once Chris's treatment in the facility was completed, his father felt it was best that he get a fresh start and sent him away to live with his grandparents in South Carolina. His grandparents were seen as the only source of stability Chritopher had ever known, which is why his dad felt it was best to send him their way. Chris seemed to be looking forward to it too. After all, his mom was out of the picture for who knows how long, and he and his dad still did not get along, so being able to stay with his grandparents was a win. Things were beginning to look up, and Chris's behavior was beginning to improve as well. As soon as Chris moved to South Carolina, it was very important for him to continue treatment. Unfortunately, this was not easy. Once they were able to finally find a doctor that treated kids like Chris, they were told that the doctor did not have access to the prescription Chris was currently taking. The doctor could not prescribe refills for Paxil and instead offered an alternative option, Zoloft. On paper, Zoloft was a prescription that was very similar to Paxil because they were both antidepressants. The doctor felt it was the best next step, so they sent Chris home with his new medicine, and his grandparents were hopeful that it would be a smooth transition. However, it was anything but smooth. Now, I'm no doctor by any means, but studies and data have shown that although both Paxil and Zoloft are similar, abruptly switching one out with the other is usually not safe or advisable. But Chris was prescribed to do so, and the results were disastrous. He began to have negative side effects almost immediately after switching to Zoloft. Chris often experienced a burning sensation all over his body and just didn't feel well overall. But the doctor wanted to give Zoloft a fair shot, so he decided to prescribe Chris pain medication to minimize the side effects that were bothering him. Chris continued to be vocal about how terrible Zoloft made him feel, even after the pain medication, so the doctor decided to increase his dosage. In fact, the doc literally doubled Chris's dosage from 100 milligrams to 200 milligrams. Wouldn't that do the opposite of helping his side effects? Studies have shown that Zoloft does have several side effects in children, which makes me wonder, why was the doctor pushing it so much? There must have been other options, right? Sadly, those were not accessible to Christopher. The laundry list of these intense side effects include aggravated depression, abnormal dreams, paranoid reactions, hallucinations, aggressive behavior, and delusions. Risks from overdose include potential manic reactions. And these were all things people began to see in Chris. He got into all sorts of altercations, including but not limited to picking fights on the school bus, choking a second grader, and sneaking up on members of his church to scare them. Chris's family became concerned, and they had every right to be. Internally, Chris claimed that he was silently battling voices in his head, telling him to do bad things. Apparently, the more he avoided it, the louder he felt the voices became. On November 28, 2001, Chris displayed poor behavior at a church service. He apparently kicked the chair of a church choir member who was obviously very upset. When Chris got home, his grandfather threatened to send him back to live with his father. He disciplined Chris by smacking the back of his thigh with a paddle, which was the start of an intense argument. In this moment, Chris recalled feeling an entire new level of anger. That night, after everyone went to bed, Chris snuck into his grandparents' bedroom. They were both sound asleep. In Chris's hands was his grandparents' firearm, which he'd been taught how to use. Chris quietly raised the weapon in his hand and pulled the trigger on both grandparents, straight in the head. Acting quickly, Chris grabbed a few personal belongings: his grandparents' car, their firearms, his dog, and a pile of cash they had in the house, $33. To cover his tracks, he then set the house on fire using a candlestick and paper and drove away. I wonder if he even knew the basic traffic laws. Also, this kid is creepily good at being a criminal. How did he know to burn the evidence? Maybe he was a big true crime fan himself. Yikes. Chris had managed to drive about 35 miles away before being stopped by the police. When he was questioned, Chris lied and claimed a large black man had iced his grandparents, kidnapped him, and set the house on fire. Chris claimed that he had escaped this man and the fire, which he felt very lucky for. Officers then took Chris to the station and confronted him again. He eventually confessed that he was the one who ended the lives of his grandparents and started the fire. Without an ounce of guilt, Chris told the officers that he believed his grandparents deserved what they got. He also said the whole thing was like a dream or a TV show to him. He was watching it all unfold and couldn't stop. But when Chris's family was brought in for further questioning, his father testified that the incident occurred 2 days after Chris's Zoloft dosage had been upped. Because of this, he claimed his son was innocent and incoherent due to an overdose. But upon further investigation, the health professionals on this case begged to differ. They reported that if the incident was really influenced by a prescription overdose, Chris would not have waited until his grandparents were asleep to attack them. They also felt this applied to Chris successfully starting a fire and escaping in time before the fire spread. It's also noted that he drove pretty far after escaping the scene, meaning he was coherent enough to operate a vehicle. I gotta agree with these health professionals. I mean, isn't that what I was saying? There was so much mastermind planning that went into this crime. Chris had to be aware of what he was doing. There were other health professionals and lawyers that sided with Chris's family and believed he was declared as manic or psychotic while on Zoloft. There were many statements released during this time where people who used Zoloft and other antidepressants shared the psychotic/manic episodes that they experienced. However, none were as extreme as Chris's story. Since Chris was still just a child, he was sent to a juvenile facility. 3 years after the incident, in 2005, his trial began as an adult. The prosecution claimed Chris executed his grandparents out of pure anger. After all, he legit told the police they deserved it. But the defense presented this as a more complex case. Chris faced many awful things in his 12 years: abandonment, abuse, and depression. Because of his new meds, Chris's lawyers claimed he was involuntarily intoxicated, making this a case of manslaughter, not murder. After a 2-week trial, the court decided that Zoloft was not 100% to blame. It was stated that Zoloft clouded Chris's brain, but he was also completely aware of what he was doing and that he knew it was wrong. While Zoloft is proven to have serious side effects on kids and teens, none of those involve harming others, only self-harm. Given that information, medical professionals found it impossible to link Chris's actions directly to Zoloft, although it still had an effect on his brain and mood. With that, Chris was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced for 30 years in prison. 5 years later, Chris pleaded guilty to 2 counts of voluntary manslaughter, and his sentence was reduced to 25 years. He is now described as a model inmate and enjoys visits with his older sister and maternal grandma, both of whom believe Chris is innocent. Chris's release date is projected to be February of 2023. That's like next year. Oh, and this is kind of weird, but there are no photos of Chris since he was a teenager accessible to the public. Next time we see him, he will be a full-grown man. Isn't that crazy? What do you all think about this? Do you agree with the court's decision? Do you think it was all Chris, or was it the overdose on his prescription that led him to go off the rails? I think it's important to note that when the case was on trial, Chris's lawyers told the entire family to come to South Carolina for the trial, except his dad. The lawyers had asked his dad to stay back because Chris openly shared that his father would beat him until he was black and blue. They knew that the judge would be asking him about his definition of discipline and abuse, and whether that played a role in Chris's behavior that night. What I think is even more interesting is that Chris's dad just agreed to do it without argument. He literally did not think he could confidently stand before the judge without accidentally admitting guilt to abusing his son. Here's another really strange thing involving Chris's dad. In an interview, he said that he had hoped to get the firearm back that Chris used to send both his parents to the grave, saying, and I quote, "I had a lot of great memories with that gun. It's not the gun's fault." Very strange that he would want that. I don't like it. Maybe when Chris's grandpa hit him that day after church, Chris was brought back to the time where he was living with his dad and it set something off in him. Either way, it does not excuse his behavior. It just might explain how things escalated so quickly in such a short period of time. Cases that involve a child as the perpetrator always leave me with so many questions. It's just so hard to imagine that someone so young is capable of such destruction. I mean, Chris's frontal cortex wasn't even fully developed when he committed this crime, yet this will affect him into the rest of his adulthood. He will have to live with this mistake for the rest of his life. Do you think that Chris was completely at fault for the crime? Or do you think his medication had something to do with it? Let me know in the comments down below. Well, thanks for watching, everyone. This is Killer Bites. My name is Brandi, and I'll see you next crime.